There is a quiet kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being surrounded and still feeling unseen. Conversations happen, laughter appears, messages arrive. And yet, something essential feels absent, like a thin pane of glass between you and the world. This disconnection rarely announces itself loudly. It settles slowly, in the pauses after social moments, in the sense that others are speaking around you, not with you. You may wonder when it started, or if it has always been this way. This feeling is not a flaw in your character. It is not a failure to belong. It is often the result of something learned quietly, long before you had words for it, a psychological adaptation meant to protect you, now asking to be understood. This chapter explores how disconnection first becomes noticeable, not as a dramatic rupture, but as a subtle emotional distance. It examines the lived feeling of being present without truly arriving, and how this state often goes unnamed for years. The focus is on recognition, emotional honesty, and the quiet confusion that accompanies this experience. Disconnection rarely begins as a realization. It begins as a sensation. A feeling that something is slightly off but difficult to articulate. You show up, you respond, you listen, and yet somewhere beneath the surface there is a faint withdrawal, not from people themselves, but from the emotional exchange between you and them. It can feel like watching life through a window, close enough to see the details, too distant to feel the warmth. There are moments when laughter happens automatically, but meaning doesn't land. When conversations move forward, yet something inside remains still. You may replay interactions afterward, not searching for what went wrong, but wondering why nothing stayed with you. This distance is often mistaken for introversion, or fatigue, or disinterest, but it is none of those things, because the desire to connect is still there. It just doesn't reach the surface anymore. What makes this kind of disconnection painful is its ambiguity. There is no single event to point to, no dramatic loss, no obvious absence, only a growing sense that emotional presence requires effort, and that effort feels strangely unsafe. People may describe you as calm, composed, independent. They may not see the internal separation, the way feelings soften before they can fully form, the way emotional reactions arrive muted, delayed, or filtered through thought instead of sensation. This is not emptiness, it is distance. And distance, unlike emptiness, has a direction. It leans away from something once approached too closely. Often, this state becomes visible during moments that should feel intimate, a meaningful conversation that somehow feels flat, a celebration that passes without imprint, a moment of vulnerability offered by someone else, received politely but not deeply. You might notice that others seem emotionally closer to each other than to you, not because they exclude, but because you remain partially unavailable, even to yourself. This can lead to quiet self-doubt, questions without urgency but with persistence. Why does connection feel harder now? Why does closeness feel distant even when nothing is wrong? Why does it feel safer to observe than to participate? The mind often searches for external explanations. Wrong people, wrong environment, wrong timing. But the body knows something else. It knows that distance once served a purpose. This emotional separation didn't appear overnight. It formed gradually as a background response, a way of staying functional while limiting exposure to something overwhelming, unpredictable, or unmet. And because it worked, because it protected, it stayed. Over time, this distance becomes familiar, even comforting. It allows control, predictability, a sense of self-sufficiency. But it also dulls resonance. Moments lose texture, relationships feel thin, joy becomes quieter, pain becomes abstract. Life continues, but something essential feels slightly out of reach. The most confusing part is that nothing feels wrong enough to justify this feeling. You may function well, achieve, maintain relationships, appear emotionally stable. which makes the disconnection feel unjustified, as if it is something you should be able to think your way out of. But this distance was never a conscious decision. It was a response, a learned pause, an emotional buffer, a silent agreement the nervous system made long ago. Stay close enough to survive, but far enough to stay safe. Recognizing this is not about labeling yourself as broken or detached. It is about noticing the pattern without judgment. This chapter is not the explanation. It is the acknowledgement. The moment you realize that disconnection is not a lack of capacity for connection, but evidence that connection once carried a cost, and that cost has not yet been fully understood. It examines how inconsistency, emotional absence, or unpredictability shape internal distancing. The focus is on understanding origins with compassion, without blame or accusation. Disconnection does not emerge in isolation. It forms in relationship. Long before it becomes a personal trait, it exists as an adaptation to an emotional environment that could not be relied upon consistently. Often, it begins in moments that seemed small at the time, needs that went unnoticed, feelings that arrived but found no place to land, emotions that were met with silence, dismissal, or confusion. Not always cruelty, more often absence. A caregiver who was physically present but emotionally preoccupied. A household where feelings were acknowledged selectively. An environment where emotional expression required careful calibration. In these spaces, the nervous system learns quickly. It learns what is safe to feel, what must be hidden, what draws connection, and what disrupts it. When emotional responses are unpredictable, the safest response becomes restraint. Children are exquisitely sensitive to emotional patterns. They don't need explicit lessons to learn when closeness is welcome or when it becomes a burden. They adjust automatically. A question left unanswered, a tear met with discomfort, an attempt at closeness that is subtly redirected. Over time, these moments accumulate, not as memories, but as posture, an internal leaning back. This is where distance begins to feel natural. In some environments, emotions are allowed, but only certain ones. Joy may be celebrated, sadness tolerated briefly, anger avoided, need quietly discouraged. In others, emotional expression may feel dangerous, not because of overt punishment, but because of the emotional fallout it creates. A parent who becomes overwhelmed, a caregiver who withdraws when vulnerability appears, an adult who needs the child to stay emotionally steady. In these moments, the child learns something profound. Connection requires regulation. So emotions become managed, filtered, softened before they can disrupt. This is not a failure of love. It is a limitation of emotional capacity, often passed down through generations. Most caregivers do the best they can with what they were given. But the nervous system does not interpret intention. It responds to experience. And the experience of inconsistent emotional availability teaches the body that closeness is uncertain. So it adapts. Disconnection becomes a form of self-containment, a way to stay emotionally intact without needing reassurance, a way to remain present without asking too much. The tragedy is that this adaptation works too well. It allows competence, independence, emotional self-sufficiency. But it also narrows emotional range. You may grow into someone who is dependable, composed, and thoughtful, someone others rely on, someone who listens well. And yet, internally, something remains carefully guarded. Not because you don't feel deeply, but because you learned early that depth must be moderated. This origin is often invisible to adult memory. There may be no dramatic event to recall, no clear wound to point to, just a subtle emotional tone that shaped development, a sense that emotions needed to be managed privately, that asking for connection required timing, that vulnerability was situational. Over time, this becomes identity, not consciously, but quietly. You become someone who feels safer inside than between. Someone who trusts self-regulation more than shared emotional space. And this is why disconnection can feel so confusing later in life, because it once preserved connection, not destroyed it. It allowed harmony, stability, belonging on conditional terms. But the conditions remained. The distance that once protected now limits, not because it was wrong, but because its purpose has changed. Understanding this origin is not about revisiting pain. It is about recognizing intelligence in the response. Disconnection is not evidence of emotional incapacity. It is evidence of emotional adaptation, a system that learned early how to stay safe without asking for too much. And what was once necessary is now simply familiar. It explains how the nervous system, attachment patterns, and emotional regulation interact to create distance. Scientific understanding is woven gently into the emotional narrative to deepen awareness. Disconnection is not a personality trait. It is a nervous system state. The body does not forget what it learned about safety. It stores it quietly in posture, attention, and emotional range. When early environments required emotional restraint, the nervous system adapts by prioritizing regulation over resonance. This means staying stable, even if it requires emotional dampening. From a psychological perspective, this is often associated with attachment patterns that emphasize self-sufficiency, not because closeness is unwanted, but because it feels unpredictable. Attachment is not about how much love was present. It is about how reliably emotional signals were received and returned. When emotional feedback is inconsistent, the nervous system learns to minimize exposure. It shifts toward internal regulation, relying on thought, logic, and independence rather than emotional exchange. This is where emotional distance begins to feel normal. Neurologically, the brain prioritizes survival before connection. If closeness once brought confusion, overwhelm, or emotional mismatch, the body remembers. So it creates buffers. Emotions are processed cognitively rather than somatically. Feelings are analyzed instead of felt. Vulnerability is understood, but not fully embodied. This is not emotional numbness, it is emotional modulation. The nervous system remains alert, not to danger, but to emotional unpredictability. Over time, this modulation becomes automatic. The brain's threat detection systems activate subtly during moments of intimacy, not enough to cause fear, but enough to reduce presence. The result is a sense of watching rather than participating. Psychologically, this can resemble detachment, dissociation, or emotional withdrawal. But at its core, it is regulation, a way to stay connected without becoming emotionally destabilized. This explains why disconnection often intensifies during moments that should feel meaningful. Deep conversations, emotional disclosures, moments of closeness. These situations activate old relational expectations, not consciously, but physiologically. The body anticipates emotional demand, and it responds by pulling back slightly. This is why the disconnection feels involuntary. You may want to feel more, to be more present, to connect more deeply, but the body prioritizes safety over intention. From a scientific standpoint, this involves the interplay between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. Emotional signals arise, but they are quickly regulated, filtered, or delayed. The nervous system remains within a narrow window of tolerance, not overwhelmed, but not fully engaged either. This state allows functioning but limits aliveness. It explains why connection feels effortful rather than natural, why emotional presence requires concentration, why closeness feels draining instead of nourishing. The system is working hard to maintain equilibrium. Importantly, this pattern does not mean the capacity for connection is gone. It means access is regulated. The nervous system learned that staying emotionally open required vigilance, so it chose consistency over depth. And because this pattern formed early, it operates beneath awareness. You don't decide to disconnect. You simply notice that connection doesn't land. Understanding this psychology reframes the experience. It removes moral judgment. It removes personal failure. What remains is a system doing exactly what it was trained to do. Disconnection is not an absence of feeling. It is the presence of protection. And protection, once necessary, does not disappear on its own. It waits to be understood. It examines how desire and resistance coexist, creating emotional tension and self-doubt. The focus is on the lived experience of wanting closeness while unconsciously avoiding it. Disconnection is rarely a lack of desire. It is more often a divided one. On one side, there is a genuine longing to be known, to feel emotionally met, to experience closeness without effort. On the other, there is a quiet resistance, subtle, persistent, and protective. A sense that too much closeness may cost something internal. This creates an emotional paradox. You want connection, but when it approaches, something inside tightens, not in panic, in caution. This tension does not feel dramatic, it feels confusing. You may initiate conversations, relationships, or emotional exchanges, and then find yourself pulling back internally once they deepen. It is not rejection, it is regulation. The body monitors emotional proximity the way it once monitored safety. And when closeness crosses an invisible threshold, the system responds. Thoughts become louder, emotions become quieter. Presence shifts into observation. This is the push and pull. Psychologically, this is where protection and desire collide. The part that learned to stay safe through distance remains vigilant. The part that longs for connection remains hopeful. Neither is wrong, but they are not aligned. This misalignment creates internal friction. You may question your sincerity, your capacity for intimacy, your emotional availability. Why does closeness feel good in theory, but complicated in practice? Why does connection feel meaningful, yet draining? The answer is not ambivalence, it is history. The nervous system remembers what the mind has long forgotten. When vulnerability once led to disappointment, emotional overload, or withdrawal from others, the body learned restraint, and restraint became synonymous with safety. So even as the desire for connection grows, the system remains cautious. This is why emotional openness can feel like exposure rather than relief, why being seen feels vulnerable, even when there is no immediate threat. The resistance is not against people, it is against unpredictability. The body does not fear closeness itself, it fears what closeness once required. This creates patterns of emotional self-monitoring. You may notice yourself editing emotional responses, choosing neutrality over expression, keeping certain feelings private, even in safe relationships. Not because you don't trust others, but because you trust your internal regulation more. The push and pull can also manifest as overthinking relationships, analyzing interactions, interpreting emotional cues. This cognitive engagement creates distance from sensation. It allows control. But control comes at a cost. Presence diminishes. Spontaneity fades. Connection becomes something managed rather than felt. This internal conflict can be exhausting, not because connection is unavailable, but because it requires constant negotiation between desire and safety. The most painful aspect is often self-blame. You may wonder why others seem to connect so effortlessly, why emotional closeness appears natural for them. What remains unseen is the internal labor your system performs, the continuous calibration, the silent vigilance. This chapter is not about resolving the conflict, it is about recognizing it. Understanding that the resistance is not a flaw, it is an echo, a reminder of a time when closeness came with conditions. And until that memory is acknowledged, not intellectually, but emotionally, the push and pull remains. Connection continues to feel both necessary and threatening, and the distance, though unwanted, continues to serve. It explores the shift that occurs when awareness replaces self-judgment. This is the turning point where meaning begins to soften the distance. There is a moment, often quiet, often unremarkable, when something changes. Not externally, internally. It happens when the question shifts from "what is wrong with me?" to "what happened to me that made this necessary?" This is not a dramatic breakthrough. There are no answers arriving all at once, just a subtle release of tension. For the first time, the distance is no longer interpreted as failure. It is seen as function, a response that once made sense. This recognition does not erase disconnection, but it changes how it is held. Instead of resisting it, you begin to observe it. Instead of fighting distance, you start listening to it. This shift matters more than it seems, because self-judgment reinforces the very patterns that created the distance. Criticism tightens regulation. Understanding allows space. The moment of recognition often arrives through contrast. You notice how easily others receive closeness, or how deeply you long for connection without fully entering it. And instead of turning that observation inward as deficiency, you allow it to become curiosity. Why does my system respond this way? What is it protecting? This curiosity is not analytical. It is gentle. It does not demand answers. It invites reflection. In this moment, disconnection begins to feel less personal, less fixed, less defining. It becomes a chapter rather than a sentence. You may begin to notice patterns without emotional charge, how your body shifts during vulnerability, how your attention moves away from sensation and into thought, not to correct it, but to witness it. This witnessing is powerful because it introduces choice, not action, but awareness. And awareness creates margin. You begin to see that the distance is not you. It is something you carry, something that formed in response to emotional conditions that no longer fully exist. This does not mean those conditions are gone. It means they are no longer absolute. The nervous system still responds as if closeness requires caution. But now there is recognition, and recognition brings dignity. There is often grief here, not loud, but present. Grief for the connection that could not be received when it was needed most. Grief for the emotional language that was never fully learned. But this grief is not overwhelming because it is accompanied by understanding. You begin to see that you did not choose distance, you learned it, and learning can be honored without being repeated. The moment of recognition does not ask you to change, it asks you to acknowledge, to see the intelligence in the adaptation, to appreciate the system that kept you safe when safety was uncertain. This reframes the entire narrative. Disconnection becomes evidence of sensitivity, not absence, of awareness, not indifference, and something subtle begins to shift. The distance no longer feels like a wall. It feels like a boundary that can be approached slowly, without pressure, without demand. This chapter marks the transition from confusion to clarity, from self-critique to self-understanding. Not because the distance is gone, but because it is no longer misunderstood. It reflects on how safety, presence, and emotional permission allow reconnection to unfold naturally. The focus remains compassionate, slow, and non-directive, honoring the body's timing. Healing in this context is not a decision. It is not an effort. It is not a technique. It is a softening, a gradual loosening of the internal grip that has been holding everything together for a long time. The nervous system does not respond to force. It responds to safety. And safety is not created through intention. It is created through experience. Softening begins when the system senses that it no longer needs to remain constantly alert, not because the world has become predictable, but because internal permission has emerged. Permission to feel without urgency. Permission to pause without explanation. Permission to remain present without managing the moment. This is subtle work, often invisible to others. It shows up as slightly longer pauses before emotional withdrawal, as moments where sensation is allowed to arrive before thought intervenes, as brief windows of presence that feel unfamiliar but not threatening. Softening does not demand vulnerability, it allows it. There is an important distinction. For a system that learned to regulate through distance, forced openness can feel intrusive. Even kindness can feel overwhelming if it arrives too quickly. So healing happens quietly, through repeated experiences of emotional neutrality, where nothing is required, nothing is expected, nothing is taken. Moments where presence is enough. This is how the inner world begins to recalibrate. The body starts to learn that closeness does not always come with cost, that emotional proximity can exist without collapse, confusion, or withdrawal. But this learning is slow, because the original pattern was learned slowly too. Softening is not linear. There will be moments of openness followed by retreat, moments of connection followed by exhaustion. This is not regression, it is rhythm. The system tests safety in increments. Each small moment of presence that does not result in harm becomes data, quiet evidence that the environment is different now. Over time, emotional sensations begin to feel less disruptive, less intense, less urgent. Not because they are suppressed, but because they are finally allowed space. Softening also involves releasing the belief that connection must be earned through composure, that emotions must be refined before they are shared, that presence must be managed to remain acceptable. As this belief loosens, emotional experiences regain texture. Joy becomes fuller. Sadness becomes more embodied. Even discomfort becomes more tolerable. This is not emotional flooding, it is emotional integration. You begin to notice that feeling does not require collapse, that presence does not require performance. And slowly, the internal world becomes less rigid. This softening does not announce itself as healing, it feels ordinary. Moments where connection lingers slightly longer, where silence feels less empty, where emotional exchanges feel less taxing. There is no finish line here, no moment when disconnection disappears entirely, but there is a shift in relationship to it. Distance is no longer something that controls you. It becomes something you can notice, respect, and gently move with. Healing, in this sense, is not becoming more emotional. It is becoming more permissive, allowing what arises to exist without immediate regulation. And in that permission, something returns. Not intensity, not drama, but quiet contact. The story closes with quiet hope, emotional dignity, and gentle acceptance. Feeling does not return all at once. It arrives the way light does in the early morning, gradually, without demand. There is no moment when the distance vanishes, no clear line between disconnection and connection. Instead, there are moments, small, ordinary, easily missed, a conversation that stays with you longer than expected, a silence that feels shared rather than empty, an emotion that arrives without immediately being analyzed. These moments do not feel extraordinary, they feel real. Learning to feel again is not about intensity, it is about continuity, feeling without interruption, without retreat, without explanation. For a system that learned to survive through distance, this is unfamiliar territory, not dangerous, just new. There may still be times when the old patterns return, when closeness feels heavy, when distance feels necessary. This does not mean healing has failed, it means the system remembers, and memory does not disappear simply because conditions change. What changes is relationship. You no longer interpret distance as a defect, you recognize it as a signal, a reminder to move gently, to allow time, to respect your own pacing. This respect creates internal trust, and trust is what allows feeling to deepen.
You begin to notice that emotions are not events to manage, they are experiences to inhabit, that connection does not require explanation, it requires presence, and presence, once felt as exposure, begins to feel grounding. There is a quiet confidence that emerges here, not the confidence of certainty, but the confidence of permission. Permission to feel what arises, permission to step back when needed, permission to remain human without performing emotional coherence. This is where disconnection loses its authority. It no longer defines you. It no longer explains everything. It becomes one part of a larger emotional landscape, a chapter that shaped you but does not confine you. The painful reason you once felt disconnected from everyone was never a lack of capacity for connection. It was a deep intelligence that learned how to protect what mattered most. And now, that intelligence is learning something new, that closeness does not always require vigilance, that presence does not always require regulation, that feeling does not always require defense. There is no urgency here, no instruction, no destination, just a gradual return to contact with others, with yourself, with the emotional world you once learned to approach carefully. And in this return, something settles, not because everything is resolved, but because nothing is being resisted. Connection, once distant, becomes possible again. Not perfectly, not constantly, but honestly. And that is enough.